this Monday, the day after we all lose an hour of the daylight savings time. It's funny. I didn't think it would affect me very much all day Sunday. I'm thinking I don't feel a thing. This isn't going to have any effect on me. And yet here I am feeling about an hour behind on a Monday. I don't know if you all feel that way also. I'd be curious to get your feedback. You're welcome to put your comments at the bottom of this post and the messages. That's one of the neat things about the Facebook Live. This is the On the Beat segment, and it comes to you every Monday, and it's brought to you by Ingles Supermarkets. And they've been sponsoring the On the Beat pieces on the website. You can read today one of my On the Beat stories about how Kirby Smart is kind of ready to let the dogs loose on opposing quarterbacks, as Georgia will use more pressure packages. And if it seemed like Georgia wasn't bringing quite as much heat as usual last year, it wasn't your imagination. Georgia was tied for next to last in the SEC in sacks, and I didn't look at the tackles for loss numbers, but they weren't real great either, and that was by design. Kirby was really big on not giving up big plays. In fact, Georgia led the nation in the fewest plays of 20 or more yards given up. If you were going to score on Georgia last year, you were going to have to earn it. You were going to have long drives, third down conversions, high percentage passes, or as LSU did, nobody wants to remember that game, but converted 4 fourth downs in that game, as Kirby Smart took a very conservative approach on defense. And I thought had a great season. I thought they did the best they could with the personnel they had. And as Kirby recently explained, it was because they were relatively young in the front seven. Remember, in 2018, Georgia was replacing 5 out of 7 starters out of that front seven, including Roquan Smith, the Mike linebacker, the inside linebacker. They called a lot of the fronts and adjustments, and there was a lot of youth there. And so Kirby didn't feel that he and Mel Tucker could be as multiple with their fronts or their pressure calls. And the trade-off, though, was a more conservative plan that didn't give up big plays. Well, next year, Georgia's going to have a different personality. He'll have a different personality all around. And I don't know how often Kirby used the term, but it's called complementary offense or complementary defense. And that's where Kirby and his staff get together and say, what are we? Who are we? What are our strengths going to be? And in Jake Fromm, you've got a third-year quarterback, and you have a very experienced offensive line that's seen a lot of different types of pressures. So this Georgia passing game, provided that Jake gets on the same page with these young receivers, which I think a large majority of the spring will be dedicated towards that pass game, meanwhile the defense working on new pressures. And so because you have an offense that can operate at a higher tempo with an experienced quarterback, I think that lends itself to a more aggressive defense, hence the complementary term of, we can play this sort of defense because we have that style of offense. And I think Kirby feels really good about Jake Fromm and his ability in the hurry up or the 2-minute or the fastball or whatever Kirby wants to call it on a given day. And James Coley likes to throw the ball around a little bit. Now, Georgia's still going to be able to run the ball. You've got a returning 1,000-yard rusher in DeAndre Swift. Make no mistake about it. I think DeAndre will rush for more than 1,000 yards and could approach 2,000 total yards if he's able to stay healthy. But how that plays into the defense, because you've got such an explosive and dynamic offense, I think Kirby feels like he can turn them loose a little bit on defense, and he has more experienced guys coming back now. 8 different players have started in that front seven. Now, they're not all regulars, but 8 different guys have drawn at least one start, and so that's why Kirby and Georgia will bring more pressure next season. I think he also feels good about his corners and his safeties. J.R. Reed and Richard LeCounte come back. Maybe the best safety duo in the SEC. It's going to be a special year for Georgia. Now, I saw today where I believe it was Bovada. They're kind of an online, offshore. They throw the odds out there. I don't even know if you can actually bet on them. But the over-under for Georgia wins was at 10.5. And, that may seem a little low when you consider that the Bulldogs have national championship aspirations. But remember, they've got a pretty difficult schedule ahead. Notre Dame comes to Georgia. And while I don't think the Irish are a major threat to beat Georgia. They're capable. The game will get a lot of attention. It'll require a lot of energy. It'll be a more physical type of game because that's the way Notre Dame likes to play, and we know Kirby likes to mix it up like that too. So maybe it's a game that is closer than it should be. It's early enough in the season where you wonder if Jake's on the same page with those young receivers. I mean, other than Tyler Simmons and J.J. Holloman, it's a lot of guys that Jake hasn't thrown a lot of passes to. And yes, we're waiting on Demetrius Robertson to catch his first pass still. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Georgia. I would take the over myself. I'm predicting Georgia to win the SEC. I think they'll beat Alabama in the SEC championship game. I'm not saying they're going to go undefeated. I'm not ready to say that simply because of the way the schedule falls. And here's what I mean by that. Georgia has 2 bye weeks. Georgia opponents have 5 bye weeks. So there's going to be 5 teams that are going to have a week off before they play Georgia. And Florida and Tennessee are 2 of those teams. The good news is Georgia's also off before the Tennessee game and before the Florida game. Now, I don't have the schedule in front of me, but I'm pretty sure Texas A&M is another one of those teams that has a week off before they play Georgia. And I want to say South Carolina as well. I'm not sure if the other one is Auburn or not. It may be. But that's going to put Georgia at a disadvantage. When a team has a bye week before they play you, not only does it give their players an opportunity to rest up and get some recuperation, but it's an extra week of preparation, an extra week of film, and one more week where your guys maybe get a little beat on before they play a team. So if I had to guess, I think maybe a 1-loss Georgia wins the SEC championship right now and goes to the college football playoff. Now, what happens in the college football playoff? You know, I could sit here and tell you I expect Georgia to win it all. I certainly think it's possible. But, guys, I've been covering college football a long time. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's how important injuries are. I saw it happen at Tennessee a few years ago. I saw Butch Jones and the Vols come off a top 25 season poised to win the SEC. Started out 5-0 and actually beat 4 teams that won divisions in FBS and then beat Georgia on that incredible Hail Mary game, the Eason and Dobbs crazy ending. But then they went to Texas A&M undefeated and lost in double overtime, got beat up and injured, and got waxed by Alabama, devastated by injuries, came back, lost to South Carolina after a bye week. Suddenly, they're playing Vanderbilt for their lives, lose to Vanderbilt, lose a New Year's Six appearance, and Butch Jones was pretty much fired at that point. He didn't get his contract extended. Josh Dobbs moved on, and Tennessee exploded 1 year later. Now, I don't think all that's going to happen to Georgia, okay? Kirby's got a lot better depth. He's got a lot more continuity on his staff, and he's got a lot better leadership and administration than Butch Jones in Tennessee had. Georgia also has a much better recruiting base. So I'm not saying, this is what's going to happen to Georgia. I don't believe it'll happen to Georgia. I think Georgia is very stable, very solid. But when it comes to the national championship game window, if you believe that this could be Jake Fromm's last year, then this is it. This is the window right here. You got to win with Jake Fromm, a third-year starter at quarterback, a great offensive line that could lose up to 4 guys to the NFL draft after next season. I don't know if you realize Isaiah Wilson, he's a third-year sophomore. He'll be eligible to go pro. Andrew Thomas, a junior left tackle. I expect him to go pro. Solomon Kinley, left guard. I expect he could go pro. Ben Cleveland could go pro. That's 4 starters right there off that mammoth offensive line that we all think so much about. And your quarterback, a third-year starting quarterback. And then what if J.J. Holloman? I'll tell you what, DeAndre Swift probably going pro. So this is a really big year for Georgia. I think the Bulldogs have got everything it takes, but they've got to stay healthy. They've got to get the right bounces. So I'm going to go with the over on the 10.5. I got Georgia going 11-1 in the regular season, beating Alabama in the SEC championship game, and then we'll see who's healthy and who gets hot. Clemson, great example, right? The Clemson team that beat Alabama would have beat anybody in college football that night, all right? But that's not the Clemson team that we saw in September and October when they had a quarterback controversy. That Clemson team wouldn't have played Georgia or Alabama within 2 touchdowns. The Alabama team that we saw in September and October with a healthy Tua and his mobility would have waxed Clemson. But the game wasn't played in August. It wasn't played in September, October, November. It was played in January. And in January, Clemson was the best team in college football. Now, where will Georgia be in January? I don't know. I know this. I know that in 2017, Georgia was the best team in college football. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. They were as good as any college football I had seen since that Pete Carroll team romped over Oklahoma and South Florida 12, 13 years before. That's how good they were. They were unbelievable. They were dominant. And now you look, and Sony Michel, and Nick Chubb, and Javon Wims, and Isaiah Wynn, and Roquan Smith, and you say, you know what, Mike, you're right. Those guys were great. But as we saw, being the best doesn't always mean you win it, right? Now that you're in a tournament sport, if it's a one game, if we're back to the way it was pre-playoff, no doubt in my mind, Georgia wins it all. And no question. But it's a 2-game playoff. Actually 3 when you consider that you have to win the SEC championship game. And Alabama, nobody wants to hear it, Alabama got a bye. They didn't even have to play in the SEC championship game. They got a bye. They played one less game. And they were just that little bit fresher, weren't they? Right? And that was just enough to beat Georgia for the 2017 National Championship. Last year, there's Georgia again, pounding Alabama in the first half. We all know what happened. Alabama came back. But Georgia played Alabama. So they should have been in the playoff. But guess what? The Georgia Tech AD and the Florida AD are now on that 13-member committee. I don't think they were proponents for Georgia to make the playoff. Now, you can look at it now and say, oh, well, look at how it turned out. Georgia lost to Texas, and oh, wasn't Clemson great? And oh, Oklahoma scored all these points after it didn't matter against Alabama. Listen, the best 4 teams didn't get in last year. 4 most deserving did. Deserving, right? But not the best. So Kirby knows what they're up against. Georgian players know what they're up against. They got a healthy chip on their shoulder. They've worked hard this offseason. They got a tough schedule with those buys, with those 5 teams having buys, and they only got 2 weeks where they have buys, okay? That's a disadvantage, but I still think Georgia's going to overcome it. They really need Jake Fromm and DeAndre Swift to stay healthy, and J.R. Reed. Those are the 3 most indispensable players on the team. So now another thing that I wrote this weekend I want to touch on, Kirby talked about that young receiving corps and Matt Landers and Tommy Bush. He said, you know what, size doesn't always equal toughness. Kirby's got a message for these guys. You better block. And if you don't block, you're not getting on the field as a receiver at Georgia. Kirby doesn't care how fast you are, doesn't care how many balls you can catch. If you don't block, you're not getting on the field at Georgia at receiver. Okay? It's not happening. And these guys need to prove that to their head coach this spring. They're going to have to prove that they can block downfield. They're going to have to show the toughness Kirby wants. That's why right now he's saying it's going to be a big group. It's a committee. Because he hasn't seen enough. Now, look, he knows J.J. Holloman and Tyler Simmons are going to block. He trusts those guys. They're returners. They've been in the rotation. But the rest, they got a lot to prove to Kirby Smart. So those have been a couple of stories that I've written here in the last couple of days. I'm going to look at my phone and look on the Facebook page and see if y'all have any questions for me. I'll be headed up to Nashville tomorrow. The basketball team plays. I know nobody's holding their breath for an upset since Rayshawn Hammonds has been ruled out. It's going to be tough. I'm not going to lie to you. But, you know, Crane's dogs, you know, they'll do what they can do. I just think they're outmanned, quite frankly. And then we've got, of course, I also had a story yesterday on Alyssa DiCarlo. Don't know if you watched Georgia women's softball. One of the best programs in the country year in and year out. She became the all-time home runs leader. Best swing I've seen. And confession, I coached travel softball for 8 years when my daughters played. So I have a very healthy respect for the women's game and fast pitch softball. And while I was at Tennessee, I covered the best pitcher in the world in Monica Abbott. So I've seen some pretty great softball. I've been out to the College World Series, I guess 4 or 5 times. I even covered Georgia last year at Arizona State and got to meet DiCarlo. She was killing it out there in Arizona last year at that tournament where she's from. So that's always been a sport I've kind of done in the off season. I haven't had an opportunity to get up to Jack Turner yet, but I'd still like to. So looking at your, looking here, spoken like a Tennessee fan, Michael Jameson. You know, This is interesting, the whole fan thing and who you cover. I'm confused because I've covered Auburn and Alabama and Tennessee and Georgia and Michigan State and Idaho State. So if I cover a team, that supposedly makes me a fan in some people's eyes. That's a really simple. That's a really simple conclusion to draw. Does that mean I'm a Georgia fan now? I know that a lot of Tennessee fans like to say I'm a Georgia fan now that I cover Georgia. And when I went from the Auburn beat to the Alabama beat, a lot of the Alabama people said you were an Auburn fan because you covered Auburn. And then when I went up to the Tennessee beat, I wore a maroon windbreaker, and Philip Fulmer said, why don't you just go to Tuscaloosa and cover your team in Alabama? So, people that grasp for that kind of thing, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. I'll tell you what does happen, though, when you're a sports writer or in any business. And I look at it as a business, okay? This is how I provide for my family. This is how I've made a living since I got out of the military when I was 21 years old. So I've been doing this 30 years and writing about people and teams and programs, whether it was the Detroit Lions or professional boxing, Kronk Gym, covered the Masters, the Olympic swimming. What happens is, as again, in any business, you meet athletes, you meet coaches, and you build relationships. And when I say relationship, like a business relationship, like Kirby Smart understands when I go to his press conference, I'm there to ask questions. If I ask a question that he doesn't like, and it has to do with the game, hey, Kirby, for example, what were you thinking on the fake field goal against Auburn? All right, there can be an exchange. I'm doing my job. He's doing his. Doesn't mean I don't like Kirby. Doesn't mean I'm second guessing. Means I think about it and I say, you know what? I'll bet fans want to know what Kirby and Georgia were thinking. So, am I a fan of Kirby Smart? No. Do I respect Kirby Smart? Yeah, I do. Because, I have opportunities to ask the man questions and he answers. He understands what I'm there for. When I covered Tennessee, I got to know Philip Fulmer really well. You cover the guy's football team for 6 or 7 years, and you ask a lot of questions, and you do a lot of one-on-ones. You get to know the guy. He understands how you operate, and there's a mutual respect there. Why? Because I don't misquote him. Because I don't write things that aren't factual, that aren't not factual, I should say. And that's how you build respect. So does it make you a fan if you've got a good relationship that I was able to pick up the phone and call Conzo Martin after the Georgia game the next day and say, hey, Georgia just put out a release that Rayshawn Hammonds is done for the year, coach. Can you give me a comment on what he means to Georgia? Well, I covered Conzo up at Tennessee, so I know him. I got his number. He answers the question. You get a quote. Here's what an opposing coach said about the value of Rayshawn. Does that mean I'm a fan of Missouri now? No. So when I talk about other programs or other coaches, it's to give perspective because Georgia's not the only college program in the country. The problems and the challenges that the Bulldogs face are not unique to this program. I've seen it happen before, comparable situations, whether it was at Tennessee or covering Michigan State or Alabama or Auburn. So I bring up comparisons to provide a perspective that maybe people who haven't watched these other programs as closely can see. So I hope I've explained that. If you want to name call and say fans and things like that, certainly it's your right. But you're embarrassing yourself, okay? So I'll go back here and look at some more of the questions and insults or whatever's there for me. Let's see here. Phil Rogers, hey, Mike, Georgia needs to play one game at a time. Win all of them. Got to beat Florida, UT, and Carolina. Kentucky, Mizzou. Phil Rogers, I agree. Kirby will approach it that way. He's not sitting here right now fretting over that, -3 disadvantage on the bye week deal, I guarantee you. But I'm looking at it in terms of a more cumulative effect and just saying, boy, you're at a disadvantage when you got a team that has a bye week that you don't. We're going to say that 3 times. The odds are one of those are going to catch up. Potentially. Doesn't mean it will, but I'm just saying it increases the odds. If all things were equal and everybody had the same amount of bye weeks, then I'd pick Georgia to go undefeated. Dylan Brand, hopefully with the new offensive coordinator, we'll get over the hump Our previous OC couldn't make adjustments. You know, Dylan, I'm kind of hung up on that one with Jim Chaney. I've known Jim Chaney for a long time. And, you know, I talked to Pat Narduzzi about him, a guy that I've got a lot of respect for. He's the head coach at Pitt now, and Jim was with him for a year. And Pat's the kind of coach that I know Pat's going to tell me what he really thinks about something. Not necessarily quoted on the record, but Pat genuinely respects this guy. And Narduzzi is a hell of a coach. And if he says this guy can coach, then I believe it. And, you know, Jim Chaney did help Jake Fromm through a season as a true freshman and get him to the national championship game. There were limitations on Jake with what he could do, even with all that talent around him. So I want to give Jim Chaney credit for that. I think Jim Chaney and Kirby Smart were somewhat pigeonholed last year with the whole Justin Fields situation. I think that one of the guarantees that Justin Fields had was that he would be able to compete for the starting position every week and that he would run the same offense as Jake. I don't think that was necessarily in Georgia's best interest. I think Georgia would have been a lot better off if Justin Fields would have had a package. But that wasn't how it was recruited, and Kirby was true to his word, and I think the hope was that Justin would stick around and continue to compete. Obviously, that didn't happen. The NCAA changed the rules in the middle of the game. Transfers became a lot easier. There was an unfortunate incident involving a baseball player, and that opened the door for Justin Fields to transfer, where it looks like he's going to be granted a starting position at Ohio State without having to compete. So all the best intentions that Georgia had and also keeping their word, I don't think that was necessarily in the best interest of last year's team. So how much of that do I put on Chaney versus Kirby versus just the way it is? I have a hard time with it. I do think James Coley brings a lot of new energy. I know the players are excited. I know they really like him. I know he's a lot more positive than Jim. Jim is an older veteran coach. He's not everybody's buddy. You know, that's not his style. Whereas Coley, I think, is more engaging. This is a younger, energetic staff now. I think that energy is going to pay off. I think there's a lot to be said. So I think it was a good hire for Tennessee because Jeremy Pruitt needed a guy that he could trust, that he would leave alone, because Jeremy's a micromanager, a lot like Kirby. Okay, nothing wrong with that. So he needed a veteran that he could trust to run the offensive meeting room, and I think Georgia was ready for some new energy. So I think Jim Chaney leaving was a win for everyone. Jim got paid a lot more money, making an average of $1.6 million, as I understand it. His daughter's there. He's a happy guy. James Coley got the promotion that he wanted and that he was going to get from the get-go, which is why he stayed instead of going to Texas A&M. He was always going to be the offensive coordinator. Eddie Gran was brought in to discuss a position coach and potentially co-offensive coordinator, but never got the offer, merely discussed, and James Coley was always going to be calling the plays. So that was a win all the way around. To answer, that's a long answer to that question, but I want to give you some background and some perspective. Chad Daniels says, dogs go 8-4. Wow, Chad. I don't know. I have a hard time believing that one, man. Chip Grumlick says, do you expect a grad transfer quarterback for 1 year? No, I don't. I don't. I think Stetson Bennett and Dwan Mathis are the guys. I think all the eggs are in the Jake Fromm basket. I could be wrong. I could be caught off guard, but I know they really like what Dwan Mathis has done already. 6'5" athlete, 215, and this kid can run. He's got a big arm. Let's see here. Kathy Garner, Fromm had a great block last play of the Rose Bowl. Jake had an amazing season. I think the world of him. I think he does a great job. I think it's going to be his team. Again, it's not negative Justin Fields. It's just when you got and Justin Fields is an incredibly talented quarterback, folks. I want you to understand that. When you watch Justin Fields throw the ball, you hear music. I mean, I'm telling you, this guy's got an arm and is absolutely a poetic athlete to watch. And I've seen some great ones, and he's a fantastic athlete. But Jake Fromm was the better quarterback, right? So, of course, there's going to be discussion on who the quarterback. And that's a compliment to both of those young men. But I think I don't know if it cost him any games. I don't know if I'd say it got to the point of being, a negative distraction. But was it there? Yes, it was there. It was there. Matt Burkholz, J.J. Holloman, obviously the front runner wideout. Absolutely I think JJ, really connected with Jake the second half of last year. Fantastic football player. I can't say enough about him. He's an NFL guy. I think he's going to assume a leadership role too. Something else to look for from JJ Holloman. Chad wants to know what branch I was in. Chad, I was in the 82nd Airborne Division of the U.S. Army when I got out of high school, and I got the GI Bill. I'm very proud to have served. That's something that means a lot to me. Don't want to get on too much of a soapbox, but a shout out to all the veterans out there. I think there's a different perspective when you've served. Not to say that there's not a lot of people that love the country. There are. But when you take that oath and you're willing to die for your country, it changes your perspective a little bit. And I respect all the men and women that have served, that have been willing to make that sacrifice. Let's see here. Matt Buchholz, back to discussing Georgia. Mike is in his feelings hard. Jacob McMillan. Mike's just keeping it real for you. I get tired of the random attacks, whether it's Twitter or here. I'd like to think when I'm doing the face-to-face with you on Facebook that you wouldn't have the drive-by insults, especially when people put their real names by it. I kind of expect it from the fake meme people. But, I want to take those questions on. I want to explain it. I'm not a coward. I'm going to stand up for what I believe and explain where I'm coming from on issues. Like I said, I've done this, 29 or 30 years now, and it's how I make my living, and I take it serious. I take it real serious. I've got a brand I represent. I got people that believe in me. I got a company that I believe in, and I got a fan base that I'm here to serve. And, I'm not always going to write what people want to read, because it's not always rainbows and unicorns. Sometimes there's some hard news. I wrote a story last week, for example. I think leadership is a question for Georgia. I'm not saying it's a problem yet, but I'm saying it's a question. When you lose two coordinators and you lose 3 of your 4 permanent captains, and you got a guy that, I don't know all the details. There's a police report out there, but a backup gets arrested for hitting somebody, innocent, not innocent, I don't know, but Kirby Smart doesn't want Georgia football players hitting people in Athens. It's not good. And for the most part, what I've seen since I've joined this beat is that the Georgia players police each other pretty well, and that's a form of leadership when guys are staying out of trouble and taking care of one another. Attack the day, Pete Williams says, absolutely. Let's see here. Buck Cofield, all of them. There are 2 bye weeks because of the way the calendar falls. Jacob McMillan, you're right. Georgia has 2, and everybody has 2. The point I was making is that 5 Georgia opponents have bye weeks the week before they play Georgia. Georgia has a bye week before 2 of their opponents, so they're kind of in a -3. Let's see, Chad Daniel, nothing but beating Alabama and Atlanta, period. That's the goal, no question. I think this is the year that finally happens. Let's see what else we got here. Oh, great. Josh Campbell brings it up. Kyrus Jackson, another guy, could have a breakout year. It was interesting last year when Georgia was having some issues with their depth. Kyrus got moved to running back. Now, I expect Zamir White to be back in the fall. I don't expect him to have to contact in the spring. I expect James Cook to be 100% in the fall, as I understand they'll work him out in the spring. I think Brian Herring is going to take on a bigger load for Georgia, maybe be the Elijah Holyfield kind of breakout guy this year. But you wonder, I do think Kyrus Jackson has the potential to do some really great things. He's an explosive athlete. He's healthy. I know Kirby is really high on him. Matt, thank you for your service in the Marines, for Matt Melendez. Maurice Long, I just saw Justin Fields this Saturday in Hollywood, very respectful. No doubt. I've never known Justin Fields to be anything but respectful. Looking here to see Amir Speed, Jarvis Hanna, another one of those DBs. I really haven't talked enough about the secondary. I'm excited to see what happens with Tyson Campbell in year 2 and Eric Stokes. It reminds me, and I never wrote this and I meant to, when I was at the NFL Combine in Indianapolis, I asked McCole Hardman, I said, okay, now that you're gone, now that you've left Georgia, who were the 3 fastest guys on the team? Who really were? And McCole said, well, I was one. I said, yeah, I want him for sure. And he mentioned Jason Stanley, and he mentioned Tyson Campbell. And so I know that Campbell had some rough moments as a true freshman, but that experience is going to bode really well for him this year. Eric Stokes, I thought, came off the bench and did a phenomenal job. And in Stokes and Campbell, I think Georgia's got two of the top corners in the league. This team is so talented. Kirby and his staff have done such a great job. And a guy that I didn't mention, we all know Dan Lanning is the new D coordinator, and Glenn Schumann got promoted to co-DC. Kirby stayed internal there, just as he stayed internal on offense. That's Kirby telling you he likes what's going on in his coaching room. He wants the continuity. That's a lot of confidence for Kirby to have. One of the outsiders that was brought in was Charlton Warren, and I'm really excited about Charlton Warren. I had the opportunity to cover Charlton's season at Tennessee, and what happened there, I only covered that program 2 years, since Butch, in 2 of Butch's years, but their defense had a really rough year in 16, and Butch Jones basically told Bob Shoop, who's at Mississippi State now as the defensive coordinator, go out and hire whoever you want to be your secondary coach. And Shoop, I don't know how much you all know about Bob Shoop, but Shoop was at Vanderbilt. They might have beat Georgia one of the years he was there. He was with Vanderbilt with James Franklin, and then he went up to Penn State with Franklin. And all 5 years, he had top 25 defenses. He goes to Tennessee. They got a lousy secondary. They're horrible. And he gets to hire whoever he wants. Him and Willie Martinez, familiar name to Georgia fans, had a bit of a falling out. And he could have picked anybody. And the guy that he picked was Charlton Warren. He hired him away from North Carolina. I don't know how much you know about Charlton, but Charlton also served. He was in the Air Force, and he was known as Mr. Intensity at Air Force because he was a workout wonder. And he coached at the Air Force Academy, and then he was handpicked to go coach at Nebraska when Bo Pelini was there. Now, Bo Pelini is gone, but Bo Pelini was regarded as a bit of a defensive guru. I mean, that speaks well. When you get hired by good defensive minds, it says something. So Bo Pelini wanted him. Then he was hired at North Carolina and was there for a couple years. And Bob Shoop handpicks him, right? Now, the interesting thing that happened with Charlton Warren was there were some rumors early on that Charlton was going to be the guy to be the new secondary coach. And Kirby had not talked to him. But it made sense because Charlton is from Atlanta and recruited that area really well. And I had some people I talked to at Florida and Georgia that said, no conversation, hasn't happened. So as the story goes, and Kirby will be able to tell this later when he makes himself available to media, he runs into Charlton out on the recruiting trail. I think they were recruiting the same guy. Guy ended up going to Florida. But they they run into each other on the recruiting trail after the LSU guy interview had washed out. The guy, great recruiter, but was he where you need to be football wise with Kirby on the same wavelength? No. So the LSU DB coach wasn't the guy. He runs into Charlton. They get to talk and they hit it off. And Charlton's the guy. And I'm really excited about what he brings because he does bring energy. Very disciplined coach. I mean, there is a right way and a wrong way to do everything with Charlton Warren. I think him and Kirby are going to really feed off each other. I mean, I think Kirby has found the yin to his yang. That's so important because Mel Tucker was about as accomplished of a defensive coordinator as there was in the country. Can't say enough good things about Mel Tucker. Brilliant tactician, great manager, a great guy for Kirby to work with. And understand, Kirby is up to his elbows in coaching. He doesn't sit back with his arms folded. He is out there. You hear his voice. You hear his whistle. He will run across the field and get after people. And if you work with Kirby smart, there's a lot of intensity there, and it takes the right people for Kirby to have around him. And I think Charlton Warren was a good fit. So we talked about a lot of things today, some on the map. I went a little off the map with you, gave you a little sports writer philosophy about people that you meet, relationships you build. And yeah, are there certain people that you want to see do well because you think they're good people? Absolutely. Everybody wants to see the good guy win. There's a lot of good guys in sports. There's a lot of good coaches. That's why they get paid millions. They make a difference in the lives of these young men. I'll tell you a quick story. I covered Alabama in the 1990s, and there was a quarterback controversy. And one of the quarterbacks was a young sophomore from a small town, not too affluent family at all. He'd had a pretty rough upbringing, and he'd gotten into some trouble. And I asked Gene Stallings, I said, are you going to penalize this player? Is he still going to compete? He said he's still going to compete, Mike. He said, I believe in this kid. He said, he's not from the right side of the tracks, as you'd like to say, but he's got a good heart, and I believe he's a good person. And he said, and as much as I want to put 11 Boy Scouts out on the field, every now and then you got to take a chance on a kid, and you got to give him an opportunity to succeed in the right environment. Well, that quarterback ended up taking over as the starting quarterback at Alabama. And while he never did play in the NFL, he went on to become an assistant coach and coached under Bruce Arians. And this past off season, he was named the head coach of the Cleveland Browns. And his name's Freddie Kitchens. And he's coaching in the NFL right now because of what Gene Stallings saw in him back then as a 20-year-old, even when things weren't going well. Kirby's got 85 guys on scholarship, and not all of them are perfect. All right, not all of them come from the proper or the best or whatever schools or star ratings or all of that. But these coaches mold these young men into people. And so while we watch them play on Saturdays, and I'll write about the scores and the statistics, the thing that I get to watch as a reporter is I get to watch these young men grow into men right before my eyes because of the relationship with their head coach, because of the relationship with their assistant coaches that somewhat become surrogate parents because mom and dad aren't here every day to watch them, and also because of the parents. And we have an opportunity to meet them through our Next Gen series, and you can really see just how much these parents invest in these players. And it's like that everywhere. It's like at Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Michigan State. The colors are different, but for the most part, there's some really good leaders. And so, yes, I have a healthy respect for these coaches I cover. There's some that I don't have as much respect for that I've run across. Don't need to name names. Yeah, so I don't know if that clears anything up for you. That makes me a fan. I don't know what it makes me. A person, I guess. A pretty real person, I'd like to think. So if you have any more comments or questions, put them right here. I'm in my feelings today, as someone said. Put the questions there on the On the Beat comment. Follow me on Twitter, at MikeGriffith32. I've got to go move my car. They're telling me my parking garage here in Athens is closed up. I don't want to get towed or get a ticket. Even with that veteran plate on there, they'll still tow it. They'll still ticket you in Georgia with that veteran plate, too. I found that out real quick when I moved here. But everybody, hey, catch up on that hour sleep tonight. Have a great Monday, and look for the basketball coverage from Nashville. Maybe Tom Crean can pull a rabbit out of his hat. Have a great Monday, everybody.